The bronze tablet sat in the curator's gloved hands at 11 minutes past midnight, and the room had gone completely silent. Not the silence of an empty building. There were still 3 researchers in that basement laboratory in Ankara. Still the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Still the faint drip of a water pipe somewhere behind the eastern wall. But a different silence had fallen. The kind that descends when a person reads something they were not supposed to find. When the letters arranged on a corroded surface spell out a name that belongs to no known language, and yet somehow, you understand what it means. Dr. Elif Shahin set the tablet down on the examination cloth, with the deliberateness of someone handling a sleeping animal. Her breath had gone shallow. Around her wrists, the blue latex gloves creaked faintly with the tension of her grip. She looked up at the overhead lamp, then back down. The tablet was rectangular, roughly 40 centimeters long and 22 wide. Bronze, or something bronze adjacent. The spectrometer results had been strange, inconclusive, the kind of readout that makes a chemist double-check their calibration. Its surface was covered in an inscription that occupied both faces. The script was columnar, dense. Every symbol pressed deep into the metal with the kind of deliberate force that meant whoever made this understood that what they were writing was meant to last. And at the bottom left corner of the front face, barely legible through centuries of oxidation, was a city name. A city that appears in no ancient text, no Assyrian merchant record, no Hittite royal decree, no Greek geographical catalogue. A name that had no business existing on any object in any archive on Earth. And yet there it was, cut into bronze, waiting. This is a story about what that name revealed when someone finally had the patience and the courage to follow it to the end. About the civilization that wrote it, the people who tried to bury it, and the knowledge encoded in those columns of symbols that certain institutions, even in our own century, have very specific reasons to prefer remain untranslated. Stay close. Some of what follows will unsettle you. Some of it will demand that you revise what you think you know about the ancient world and who was allowed to build it. The tablet had been found 8 months earlier, in the spring, during a pipeline survey 30 kilometers southeast of the town of Yozgat, in the high plateau of central Anatolia. The landscape there is severe and beautiful, rolling hills of pale grass cut by creek valleys, the occasional outcrop of limestone rising from the earth, like a shoulder blade pushing through thin skin. It is ancient land. Every farmer who works it knows this. Plowing a field in this region means accepting that the plow will eventually strike something old. What the survey team struck was not a plow. A ground-penetrating radar unit, mounted on a modified tractor, detected a subsurface anomaly at a depth of approximately 4 meters. Rectangular, regular. Far too regular to be geological. The team lead, a geological engineer named Murat, noted the coordinates, flagged the site for follow-up, and drove on. There were another 20 kilometers of pipeline corridor to survey before sunset, and no one was authorized to excavate anything, and the spring wind off the plateau was cold enough to make hot tea more interesting than archaeology. It was a local farmer named Halil Demir who actually opened the ground. He had watched the radar truck pass through his wheat field without explanation, had seen the flag planted in the soil 30 meters from his irrigation ditch, and had spent 3 nights lying awake considering what a rectangular object 4 meters beneath his land might mean for the value of his farm, his family's future, his son's university tuition. On the fourth morning, he borrowed a backhoe from his cousin. He dug carefully. The object he struck was not, as he had hoped, a chest of Byzantine coins. It was a stone-lined chamber, roughly 2 meters by 1.5, roofed with flat limestone slabs. The walls were dry-stacked without mortar, and the interior was sealed. Had been sealed, apparently, for a very long time. Inside, wrapped in a textile so degraded it dissolved on contact with air, lay the bronze tablet and 4 ceramic vessels filled with a carbonized organic material that later analysis would identify as a mixture of grain, resin, and something else. A compound the laboratory in Ankara was still, as of the night Elif held the tablet, unable to identify with certainty. Halil Demir photographed everything on his phone. Then, to his considerable credit, he called the local museum rather than a dealer. The museum director, a careful man named Omer, drove out to Yozgat the same afternoon, inspected the chamber without touching it, and called the Ministry of Culture. The ministry sent a team. The team documented, bagged, and transported. And the bronze tablet began its journey through the bureaucratic digestive system of Turkish heritage archaeology, which processes discoveries with great thoroughness and moderate speed until it arrived in Ankara and landed eventually in the hands of Elif Şahin. Elif had spent 17 years studying the material culture of Bronze Age Anatolia. She had written her dissertation on the administrative archives of Hattusa, the Hittite capital. She spoke Hittite cuneiform as fluently as most people speak a second language, meaning with effort and occasional grammatical error, but with genuine comprehension. She had handled tablets before, hundreds of them. She had never handled anything like this. The first anomaly was the metal itself. Bronze Age Anatolian tablets were almost exclusively clay, fired or unfired, depending on whether they were meant for permanent storage or temporary use. The Hittites wrote on clay. The Assyrian merchants who operated in Anatolia during the 2nd millennium BCE wrote on clay. Bronze inscriptions existed, but they were rare, and they were almost always dedicatory. Short texts on weapons or vessels naming a king, a god, a battle. A long columnar inscription on a bronze slab covering both faces. Roughly 800 individual symbols. This was something outside the known repertoire. The second anomaly was the script. Elif had called in 2 colleagues that first evening, and the 3 of them had stood around the examination table for 4 hours, simply cataloguing the signs. Some were familiar. There were elements that resembled late Bronze Age Anatolian hieroglyphics. The pictographic script used by the Luwian-speaking peoples of Anatolia during the 2nd and early 1st millennium BCE. There were other elements that resembled, faintly, Proto-Sinaitic script, the early alphabetic system that emerged in the Levant around 1900 BCE and eventually gave rise to the Phoenician alphabet and, through it, most of the writing systems used in the world today. And there were signs that resembled nothing any of the 3 of them had seen before. Not in any corpus, not in any comparative chart. Signs that seemed to operate on a different structural logic from the symbols around them, as though a second hand, or a second tradition entirely, had contributed to the inscription. The third anomaly was the city name. Elif had read it 3 times before she said it aloud. It was composed of 5 signs. She was fairly confident about 3 of them, based on their resemblance to known Luwian hieroglyphic values. The phonetic reading that emerged from those 3 signs was something approximating the syllables Ashkara. The other two signs she could not read with confidence, but Ashkara, or some variant of that pronunciation, appeared at the bottom of the front face, and again twice on the reverse face, and possibly a third time in a different sign combination that might represent a gentilage form, a word for the people of that city. Elif searched every database she had access to. She contacted 3 colleagues by email that same night, attaching photographs. She pulled every Hittite text she knew that catalogued subjugated or allied cities. She checked the Assyrian merchant tablets from Kultepe, which name dozens of Anatolian towns. She checked the lists of cities destroyed during the Bronze Age collapse. She checked the obscure geographic text from the reign of Tudhaliya IV, which lists Anatolian territories in a damaged and partially unreadable condition. Nothing. Ashkara, by that name, by any phonetically adjacent variant, in any script, appeared nowhere in the existing record. And this was when the silence fell. Because there are 2 explanations for a city that leaves no trace in the record. The first is that the city was small, peripheral, administratively invisible, the kind of settlement that archaeologists call a secondary center, below the threshold of literate record-keeping in the great capitals. Many such settlements existed. Most will never be found. This explanation is comfortable and professionally acceptable. The second explanation is more difficult. A city can also be absent from the record because someone at some point made a deliberate effort to remove it. Cuneiform archives were not immune to revision. Hittite kings who fell from favor were sometimes subject to damnatio memoriae, the systematic erasure of their names from monuments. Temples were destroyed, libraries were burned or buried, or allowed to decay in ways that were perhaps not entirely accidental. History is not a neutral transcript. History is written by the institutions that survive, and institutions that survive have reasons for the shape of what they remember. The bronze tablet from Yozgat was raising the second possibility with uncomfortable insistence. Elif spent the following 6 weeks building a working grammar. She was not alone in this. A colleague of hers, a linguist named Arash Sadeghi at the University of Tehran, who had spent years on undeciphered Bronze Age scripts, agreed to collaborate under a confidentiality arrangement that both of them understood was somewhat irregular for academic work. There was also a specialist in ancient Near Eastern metallurgy, a Dutch researcher named Hanneke Vos, who came to Ankara specifically to analyze the bronze itself, and ended up staying 3 weeks longer than planned. Hanneke's analysis of the metal composition was the first concrete discovery that shifted the shape of the investigation. Bronze, as a technology, is an alloy of copper and tin, and the proportions and trace element signatures of ancient bronze objects can often be traced back to specific ore sources. The copper signature of the Yozgat tablet pointed to the Ergani Maden mines in southeastern Turkey, a known Bronze Age copper source, consistent with Anatolian manufacture. But the tin signature was something else entirely. The tin in the tablet's alloy did not match the Central Asian or Aegean tin sources that Bronze Age Anatolian metalwork typically drew from. It matched with a statistical confidence that Hanneke characterized as striking tin ore deposits in the mountains of northwestern Iran, specifically the region south of Lake Urmia. This was not impossible. Trade routes in the Bronze Age were extensive, and tin was valuable enough to travel enormous distances, but the combination of local copper and very specific Iranian tin in an alloy proportion that was slightly different from standard Bronze Age formulations higher tin content than usual, which would have made the finished metal harder and more durable, suggested a manufacturing tradition outside the mainstream of known Anatolian metalwork. Someone in that unknown city had known exactly what they were doing. They had sourced rare tin from a specific distant location. They had adjusted the alloy ratio deliberately to make the tablet harder. They had designed this object to survive. They had wanted the inscription to last. The question was why. And this brought Elif and Arash back to the text itself, which was beginning, very slowly, to yield. The breakthrough on the script came not from the Luwian hieroglyphic elements, which Elif understood relatively well, nor from the Proto-Sinaitic elements, which Arash was mapping carefully, but from the unidentified signs, the ones that seemed to belong to a third, unknown tradition. Arash, working alone in Tehran on digital photographs, made the observation that these unidentified signs seemed to function not as phonetic symbols, but as semantic markers, as classifiers, as a layer of meaning laid over the phonetic text to specify which category of reality a given word belonged to, whether something was divine or earthly, or belonged to the category of things that change, or the category of things that endure. This was a feature known in other ancient scripts. Egyptian hieroglyphics used determinatives in exactly this way. So did Sumerian cuneiform. The idea that a third tradition, unknown to scholarship, had independently developed the same technique, or had inherited it from some shared ancestor of all these systems, was the kind of observation that can make a linguist's hands go still over the keyboard. Arash typed a message to Elif at 2 a.m. Tehran time. I think these aren't symbols from a second hand. I think they're the oldest layer. I think the other signs were built on top of these. Elif read the message at 4 a.m. Ankara time, because she had not been sleeping well. She sat in her apartment kitchen with a glass of tea that had gone cold, and read the message 4 times. Then she looked at the digital photographs spread across her laptop screen, the dense columns, the familiar and unfamiliar signs, the city name at the corner, and felt the specific vertigo that comes when a framework you have spent years building turns out to be standing on ground that goes much deeper than you knew. If Arash was right, then what they were looking at was not a provincial text written in a local variation of regional scripts. What they were looking at was something that predated those scripts. The Luwian elements and the Proto-Sinaitic elements might be adaptations, later layers grafted onto an older system that had originated somewhere in this same region, centuries or perhaps millennia, before the Bronze Age empires that the academic world had spent 2 centuries mapping and cataloguing. The bronze tablet might not be a product of Anatolian Bronze Age culture. It might be a transmission of something older, something that Bronze Age culture had itself inherited and partially understood. And if there was a city, Ashkara, where this older tradition had been preserved, practiced, maintained long after it had faded elsewhere, then the absence of that city from the historical record took on a different weight. 6 weeks after the initial examination, Elif received an email from a researcher at a European institution whose name she recognized, an epigrapher with a long publication record and considerable institutional standing. The email was collegial in tone, complimentary about her previous work, and contained a very specific question. Had the Yozgat tablet been fully catalogued and officially accessioned into the museum's permanent collection yet? Elif answered truthfully. The accession process was ongoing. The researcher wrote back within the hour. He suggested gently that given the complexity of the script and the questions it raised, it might be worth considering a collaborative publication framework that would bring additional expertise and resources to bear on the analysis. He named an international consortium. He mentioned, almost in passing, that the consortium had existing relationships with the Ministry of Culture. Elif forwarded the email to Arash without comment. Arash wrote back, "Be careful." She had been careful before. She was a researcher of 17 years standing in a field where careers were shaped by who controlled access to significant objects. She understood how these systems worked. But something about the speed of that reply, 1 hour after a message sent late in the day, lodged in her chest like a splinter. She went back to the tablet. By this point, the translation was fragmentary, but advancing. The text appeared to be divided into 3 distinct sections. The first section, the upper third of the front face, seemed to be an account of origins. It described, as far as Elif and Arash could render it, a founding event. A city built in a mountain valley, established by people who had come from elsewhere. The direction markers suggested south or southwest, though ancient directional notation was rarely precise by modern standards. The founders were described using a sign combination that the semantic markers classified as belonging to the category of those who carry knowledge across water. This phrase, or something close to it, appeared 3 times in the first section. Those who carry knowledge across water. The second section, the lower portion of the front face and the upper half of the reverse, was more technical. It described processes. The semantic markers here shifted to the things that endure category, and the content seemed to involve ratios, quantities, sequences of operations. Haneke, when Elif described this section, said immediately, "A technical manual. Not a metaphor, not a myth, a procedure. Step-by-step operations described in a formalized notation that had been developed for this purpose. The question was what the procedure was for." The third section, the final portion of the reverse face, where the city name appeared twice more, was the most damaged, and also in the portions legible, the most disturbing. The semantic markers shifted category entirely. The new category was one Arash had labeled tentatively, things that were sealed so they would not be found. This was not a standard determinative in any known script. This was something constructed specifically for this text. A category invented to describe something that the writers of this tablet understood needed to be hidden. And the text in this section described a location. Not the city. The city was the source, but a secondary location elsewhere, where something from the city had been placed and sealed. The tablet itself said that the tablet was a key. Elif read that passage 4 times in the quiet of the laboratory, while the fluorescent lights hummed and the water pipe dripped, and understood that she was holding, in her blue latex gloves, an object that its makers had designed not merely to survive, but to function. The tablet was not a record of something lost. The tablet was an instruction. It described where to look and what to do when you got there. It said, in the oldest layer of its script, in the signs that predated all the empires, "What we buried here is what we learned. Go and receive it." The location described in the third section was not clear enough to pinpoint from the text alone. The directional markers were present, but required calibration against a known landmark. And the landmark named in the tablet was, predictably, a feature of the city Ashkara itself, whose location was not yet established. But the description of the terrain was specific enough to narrow the search region. Mountain valley, permanent water source on the eastern side, a rock formation described by 3 signs that Arash translated, with some hesitation, as the shoulder of a sleeping figure. And an elevation marker, a relative measurement, not absolute, but suggesting the sealed location was higher than the city by a distance equivalent, in the ancient measurement system apparently used by the tablet, to approximately 150 meters. Elif spread the topographic maps across the laboratory table on a Tuesday in October, 7 months after the tablet's arrival in Ankara, and began looking. She was looking for a valley in a specific region of central Anatolia, roughly consistent with the find site near Yozgat, that contained permanent water on its eastern side, a distinctive rock formation, and a secondary elevation to the north or northeast, approximately 150 meters above the valley floor. She was looking, in other words, for Ashkara. The geological survey data for the Yozgat region is detailed. Central Anatolia has been mapped extensively for agricultural, mineral, and infrastructure purposes, but the maps show geology and hydrology and elevation. They do not show what lies beneath the surface, what chambers might be sealed below limestone slabs, what objects might be wrapped in degraded textile 4 meters down in ground that has been plowed for 3,000 years. What Elif found on the topographic maps was not a city. Cities are not visible on topographic maps unless the mounds they left behind are large enough to register as topographic features. In Anatolia, these mounds are called hoyuks, the same word used across the region, and there are thousands of them. Some are excavated, most are not. What she found was a valley 14 kilometers southwest of the Yozgat find site. A valley with a permanent creek, the Akçay tributary, running along its eastern margin. A valley bounded on the northern side by a limestone ridge that, on the topographic contour lines, produced a profile that could be described, had in fact been described in a geological survey from 1987, as a reclining figure formation. The survey team had noted it as a minor scenic feature and moved on, and at the head of that valley, exactly where the contour lines climbed steeply toward the ridge, there was a hoyuk. It appeared in one heritage survey from 1994, listed as a site of probable prehistoric interest, unexcavated, low priority, approximate size 2.3 hectares. It had never been assigned a site number in the main registry. It had no excavation history. In 30 years of subsequent surveys, it had simply, quietly, not come up again. 2.3 hectares. For an unexcavated Anatolian Bronze Age site, that was not small. That was the footprint of a functioning town. Elif's hands were entirely still on the topographic map. Outside the laboratory window, Ankara was conducting its regular October nighttime business. Traffic, a distant construction alarm, the barking of a dog 2 streets over. The world was proceeding normally, and on the table in front of her was a map showing the probable location of a city that had been erased from every record, that had preserved a writing tradition predating the Bronze Age empires, that had buried a bronze tablet with a specific instruction to come and find what they had hidden, and that had, in the 30 years since its mound was first noted in a heritage survey, somehow failed to attract the follow-up attention that any site of that size would normally generate. Low priority, unexcavated. She thought about the European researcher and his 1-hour reply. She thought about the phrase, existing relationships with the Ministry of Culture, She looked at the Hoyuk on the map for a long time. There are moments in an investigation when you understand that the question is no longer only archaeological, when the silence around a site is not the silence of neglect, but the silence of management. Elif had been in this field long enough to know that both kinds of silence exist, and long enough to know that they feel different. Neglect is passive and uniform, and has the texture of dust. Managed silence has seams. It has edges where the normal flow of institutional attention stops abruptly and then resumes, as though something interrupted it, and the interruption was smoothed over. The 1994 Heritage Survey that noted the Hoyuk had been conducted by a regional team from Ankara University. She found the original report in the university archive, scanned and uploaded in 2011. She read it carefully. The site description was brief. The recommendation for follow-up study was standard. The author's signature was at the bottom. She searched the academic record for follow-up publications from the same team on the same region. There were none. The team had published extensively on other sites in the Yozgat region. This one Hoyuk, the one in the valley with the creek and the limestone ridge, appeared once in 1994, and then vanished from their published work entirely. She searched the author's name in the broader literature. He had retired from the university in 2003. He had published a general text on Central Anatolian Bronze Age settlements in 2001. She ordered the book through the university library. It arrived the following week, a slim volume with a blue cover and a photograph of a Hoyuk on the front. A different Hoyuk, one of the well-known ones. She read the entire book in 2 evenings. On page 147, in a chapter on the settlement patterns of the Yozgat region, there was a footnote. Footnote 23. A single sentence that read, "A site of uncertain period and cultural affiliation observed near the Akchai tributary in the second survey season has been excluded from this analysis pending further examination." Pending further examination. The book was published in 2001. The author retired in 2003. The further examination had never come. A single sentence in a footnote. That was all that remained in the published record of Ashkara. Elif photographed the footnote with her phone. She sent the photograph to Arash in Tehran. She sat in her apartment with the blue book in her lap and looked at the wall for a while. Arash wrote back after an hour. Who told him to leave it out? She did not know. She might never know. The retired professor was, she discovered through a quiet inquiry to a colleague, living in Izmir, and was not in good health, and was not receiving professional visitors. This avenue, if it was an avenue, was not one she could pursue quickly or easily, or without causing harm to an elderly man who may have had very ordinary reasons for a very ordinary editorial decision. But the footnote was a seam, a place where the managed silence had not been perfectly smoothed. She went back to the translation. The second section of the tablet, the technical section, the one Hanneke had called a manual, had been the most resistant to analysis because its vocabulary was highly specialized, and its grammar was tightly constrained by the notation system in ways that made standard linguistic inference difficult. But by November, 8 months after the tablet's arrival, Arash had made enough progress that the broad structure of the second section was becoming clear. It was a description of an astronomical system. The processes described, the ratios, the sequences, the operational steps, were a method of tracking specific celestial cycles using fixed observation points and a notation system for recording positional data over extended time periods. Not a simple agricultural calendar. A precision instrument, described in the language of a technical manual, for tracking the movements of at least 4 identified celestial objects, almost certainly the Sun, the Moon, and 2 planets, though the identification of which planets was still uncertain, against a fixed reference frame defined by specific stars. The system described in the tablet was more sophisticated in certain specific ways than anything documented in the Bronze Age astronomical traditions of Mesopotamia or Egypt. Not more sophisticated in every way. The Babylonian mathematical astronomy of the first millennium BCE was extraordinary, and this system predated it by centuries at minimum. But in its treatment of certain long-cycle celestial phenomena, precession-related observations, possibly, or multi-year planetary return periods, it described a body of data that implied long-term, systematic, multi-generational observation going back further than any established astronomical tradition on record. Elif's hands had stopped being entirely steady a long time ago when she worked on this text. By November, they had developed a specific tremor when she sat down to the photographs. Not fear, exactly, but the physiological response to sustained proximity to something whose full implications she could not yet fully see. Those who carry knowledge across water. The founders of Ashkar had brought this astronomical system with them. It had not originated in the Anatolian highland valley, where the city was eventually built. It had come from somewhere else, had been preserved and refined over generations, and had been encoded deliberately, carefully, permanently, into a bronze tablet with a hardened alloy specifically designed to last. And then the tablet had been buried in a sealed chamber outside the city itself, as a backup, as an anchor, as a message to whoever came after the city was gone. Because the city was already gone when the tablet was buried. Elif was now almost certain of this. The third section of the text, the things that were sealed so they would not be found, section, was written with a grammatical construction she and Arash had been debating for weeks. A verb form that implied completed action seen from a point of future looking back. The city was described in this section using past tense markers. The people were described as scattered. The tablet itself was described as what remains. Someone had buried the tablet after the city's end. They had sealed the chamber and laid limestone slabs over it and walked away, leaving the bronze and the knowledge inside, waiting for hands that would know what to do. And 150 meters above the valley floor, in a location described relative to the city's own landmarks, there was something else. Something they had called, in the oldest layer of the script, the thing that the city carried. The primary repository, of which the tablet was only the key. Elif applied for an emergency excavation permit in December. The permit process in Turkey for new archaeological sites is thorough and requires documentation, site assessment, institutional backing, and ministry approval. Elif had the documentation. She had the tablet. She had Hanukkah's metallurgical report and Arash's linguistic analysis and the topographic mapping and the 1994 Heritage Survey and the footnote from the Blue Book. She had, in short, an unusually complete case for a site that had not yet been touched. The application was received. The ministry's Department of Archaeological Affairs assigned it a reference number. The standard processing time was 60 days. On day 47, she received a phone call from a ministry official she had not previously spoken with, who told her that the application had been flagged for additional review due to the sensitive nature of the associated object, and that processing would be extended by an indeterminate period pending consultation with relevant stakeholders. Relevant stakeholders? She asked who the stakeholders were. The official said he was not at liberty to specify. He was polite. He said these things take time. He said she would be notified. She put the phone down and sat in her office, with the afternoon light coming through the window at a low winter angle, and understood, with a clarity she had been holding at a careful distance for months, that she was looking at the second kind of silence. The silence with seams, the silence that has been arranged. She called Arash. She told him exactly what the official had said, word for word. Arash was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you had good digital copies of everything?" "Since August," she said. "And the originals are in the museum, properly accessioned?" "Yes." "Then what they are managing," Arash said carefully, "is the excavation. The tablet is already out. The tablet is already in the record, even if the record is thin. That's something." That was something. She held on to it. She spent the winter writing. She wrote a full preliminary report on the tablet's linguistic analysis and submitted it to 2 journals simultaneously, a practice that is technically against most journals' policies, but which she did deliberately and with full awareness, because 2 simultaneous submissions meant 2 independent records and 2 editorial processes that would need to be separately managed if someone wanted to suppress it. She uploaded the full text of Arash's grammatical analysis to the university's open access repository under both their names. She sent detailed documentation packages to 4 colleagues at institutions in 4 different countries, with a cover letter that explained the situation straightforwardly and asked each of them to hold the materials in case of need. She was building redundancy. She was doing what the makers of the bronze tablet had done, creating multiple copies, multiple depositories, insurance against the destruction of any single repository. She was, in her own way, learning from them. The permit came through in March, 14 months after the tablet had been found in Halil Demir's field. The approval was for a preliminary survey and test excavation of the Hoyuk site in the Akçay Valley, to be conducted by a team from the museum under Elif's direction, with ministry observer presence and a 2-week timeline. 2 weeks for a 2.3-hectare site that had never been touched. It was a short window, and they both knew it. But it was a window. The team of 5 drove out to the valley on a morning in late March, when the plateau was still cold, and the grass was the pale gold of winter not yet fully released. They turned off the main road onto a track that descended between limestone outcrops into a valley that widened as they drove, the creek appearing on their right, the far ridge rising ahead. When Elif first saw the Hoyuk, a low, rounded rise at the valley's head, broader than it appeared on the map, with a scatter of pottery sherds visible on its eroded flanks, even from 50 meters away, she stopped walking for a moment. The other members of the team moved around her. The plateau wind pushed through the dry grass with a sound like breathing. She had been looking at this place for 7 months on topographic maps. She had read its description in the script of people who had lived and died here several thousand years ago. She had held, in blue latex gloves, the object that those people had made and buried and left for whoever came. The mound was not large by Anatolian standards, but it was real. Under that rounded rise of accumulated earth, under the compacted debris of centuries, under the limestone and ash and broken ceramic and corroded metal of a community that had lived and built and eventually ended here, there was a city. There had been a city. And above it, on the slope where the ridge climbed toward the limestone formation that looked, from the valley floor, exactly like a reclining figure. A shoulder, a hip, the suggestion of a face. 150 meters up, there was something sealed. The survey excavation found what surveys find in their first week. Architectural remains, dense and well-preserved at the lower levels. Mud brick walls, a flagstone surface that may have been a courtyard or a public space. A concentration of ceramic material that pointed to the late 3rd or early 2nd millennium BCE for the primary occupation phase, with a scattering of earlier material below. Burned grain. Carbonized wood, consistent with a destruction event. The specific material signature of a site that had ended abruptly, rather than faded gradually. A city that had been destroyed or abandoned suddenly, not one that had simply declined. A destruction event. Ashkar had ended violently, or under conditions that produced the same archaeological signature as violence. Fire, rapid abandonment, no evidence of an organized withdrawal of valuable materials. Whatever had happened here had not been planned by the people who lived through it. The bronze tablet, carried out of the city and buried at a safe distance, the knowledge encoded and sealed, had been the action of someone who knew the city was ending and had time enough to do one thing before it did. One thing. They had saved what they knew. On the 9th day, with 5 days of the permitted survey remaining, Elif led a small team up the slope to the north of the mound. The ascent was steep, the limestone breaking through the thin soil in long pavements. The ridge profile was unmistakable from up here, the reclining figure more clearly legible when you were on it than when you looked up from below. She counted her elevation carefully against the altimeter reading from the valley floor and the Hoyuk summit. At approximately 140 meters above the valley, close enough given the imprecision of ancient measurement, she stopped. The ground here was flat, a natural shelf in the hillside, sheltered from the north wind by a limestone outcrop. The grass was short and sparse. There was nothing visible on the surface, nothing at all to distinguish this patch of hillside from any other, except when she knelt and looked closely at the soil immediately against the base of the limestone outcrop. There was a faint, linear discontinuity. A place where the ground had been disturbed and had settled back over a very long time into a slightly different alignment. The kind of mark that means, to a trained eye, that something was placed here deliberately. They excavated carefully. 1 square meter at first, then expanding. At a depth of 80 centimeters, they struck the first limestone slab. Flat, heavy, placed with the same dry-stacked precision as the chamber near Halil Demir's wheat field, 14 kilometers away. The ministry observer, a young man who had been efficient and unobtrusive, and who had, over 9 days, become genuinely curious about the site, stood at the edge of the excavation and looked down. The afternoon light came in at a low angle from the west. The valley below was gold and shadow. Elif looked at the limestone slab and thought about the person who had placed it here. In what season? Under what sky? With what in their hands and what in their chest as they pressed the stone into the earth over what the city had known, and walked away down this slope, and did not look back, or perhaps did look back. Once at the valley, at the mound that was already beginning to look like a mound, the buildings under their first layer of ash and collapse, and then walked out into whatever world remained after Ashkara. She placed her palms on the limestone slab. The stone was cold from the March air. She could feel the slight roughness of it through the latex gloves, real and specific. A material thing made by hands, placed by hands, found by hands. The slab came up in 2 pieces when they lifted it. Below it, another slab. Below that, a void. A chamber, smaller than the one near Yozgat. Perhaps 1 meter by 1 meter, no more. Sealed. Intact. Inside, visible in the light of 2 headlamps and 1 camera flash. Ceramic vessels. Their stoppers intact. Sealed with what appeared to be a resinous substance. A wooden object, collapsed into a flattened shape, but still recognizable as having been a flat wooden board or panel of some kind. And on top of everything, placed deliberately on top, as though last in and first to be seen, something wrapped in layers of the same textile and resin composite that had preserved the bronze tablet for 3,000 years. The same makers, the same hands, the same care. They did not open it at the sight. Everything was documented, photographed, measured, recorded. The sealed chamber's contents were extracted, wrapped, and transported. The ministry observer signed the documentation. The team drove back to Ankara in the dark, not speaking much. The plateau outside the windows becoming invisible as the night completed. In the laboratory, under the familiar fluorescent lights with their familiar hum, Elif unwrapped the textile and resin composite with the same deliberateness she had used on the bronze tablet 14 months before. Inside was a clay tablet, not bronze this time, but fine-grained clay, fired to a hardness that had preserved it through the centuries in the sealed chamber. Larger than the bronze tablet, more densely inscribed. Both faces covered in the same 3-layered script, the same columnar structure, the same semantic classifier system. But more of it, more of all of it, a fuller text, a wider range of vocabulary and notation, evidence of a more extensive knowledge base than the bronze tablet had hinted at. Not a backup, not a key. This was what the key had been designed to unlock. The astronomical data encoded in the clay tablet, as Arash translated it over the following months, in a collaboration that had by then become the most important work of both their careers, was of a scope that is difficult to characterize simply. The observation records it contained spanned, by the astronomical cycles they documented, a period of several hundred years. Multigena